Assalamu alaikum and peace be with you. This is Imam Malik Mujahid and you're watching Muslim Network TV. We're always there 24/7 on Galaxy 19 satellite. It covers the United States, east to west, north to south, as well as what is in our north, whole Canada and whole Mexico. We're also streaming on OTT devices like Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and you can download our app, Muslim Network TV, on Apple as well as iPhone as well as Android. And our website is muslimnetwork.tv. It's the amazing world. There was a lot of conspiracy theories and coming out and about the pandemic, and different people are writing articles. Social media, there is a lot of what information will go on and what information will not go on is being controlled. And in that, Amazon banned 2 books. One was written by a conspiracy theorist about the COVID and the what is not being published and things like that. He protested. And Amazon listened to that protest and restore a conspiracy-laden book about the virus. But there was another book. And that book compared what is going on here. How come China is able to control with just 5,000 deaths, and in America, at the time of writing the book, it was 230,000, and now we know it's 285,000 people have died. So comparing, and it has a ideologically charged title, Capitalism on Ventilator. They protested, they demanded that Amazon restore this book, but they refused to do that. And we have the author of that book, who is a longtime peace activist, does not care for sanctions, and probably likes to see an absence of a Cold War in this world. And that person is Sara Flounders. Peace be with you. Welcome to Muslim Network TV, Sara.
Thank you. So good to be joining you here, Imam Malik.
Sara Flounders has been an anti-war organizer since the 1960s. She has recently co-authored the book which I was referring to, an anthology, Capitalism on a Ventilator, the Impact of COVID-19 in China and the United States. Well, you have been marching since 1960s, huh?
Well, yeah, I guess so. Long time.
When was your first march? Tell me.
Against the Vietnam War back in about 1968. Yeah.
1968. Wow.
Then more so 50 some years, yeah, right? Yeah.
All right. Well, tell me, do you think Biden victory means more wars, more sanctions, or more of the same? What is going to happen in this?
Well, I think there are such high hopes, expectations, wishes for what the Biden election means. And certainly it is extremely important that Trump was defeated because of his racist, arrogant, totally offensive and divisive conduct. But at the same time, President Biden himself has promised there will be no substantial change in U.S. policy. And by the very nominees to his cabinet, and also what he himself stands for, it is a policy, unfortunately, in the U.S. of endless war. More than 800 U.S. bases around the world, tens of thousands of troops in all different countries, and a policy of sanctions, of starving down any country that opposes U.S. policy on any level. So now 1/3 of the population of the world is living in countries under U.S. sanctions. And as I say, a network of military bases. Now here in the U.S., for many people, they're not conscious that the US is presently at war, because these are troops of occupation, these are drone attacks and assassinations that go on a daily basis. So it's an important time for the anti-war movement to also demand of the new administration a policy of no wars, and to end the sanctions and end this huge military apparatus, far larger than the whole rest of the world combined in military expenditures. And then we wonder why there is no national health care plan here in the US, why there's no money for any of the things that we desperately need here. And yet there's endless, literally in the trillions of dollars, money from militarism and war. So I think the anti-war movement has a big task to fulfill in continuing to raise those issues and being consistent, not only during the times against Trump, but also of demanding of this new administration, no war, end sanctions, bring troops home.
So it seems you don't quite trust President Obama, who says that Biden was the least supporting of any war during his administration.
Well, it would be wonderful, but as I say, the wars aren't only by the president. There is an enormous US military establishment, more than 18 different military intelligence agencies. It is operating around the world. And a president has a whole series of advisors and think tanks and policymakers and pressures from the military industries, from the oil industries, from banking, which knows that war is endlessly profitable. It's like an open ticket. So those are the things that propel war. And we do know that Biden, in the Obama-Biden administration, spoke again and again for military action, whether it was the expansion of NATO, whether it was action in the Ukraine, or keeping troops in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I have never seen, Biden be a voice for peace. So I think we have to keep the focus on U.S. policy rather than personalizing it in the hopes of any one person, because that's not how policy gets decided in the U.S. It's decided by big, powerful corporate interests.
With the rise of the, People's Republic of China and, challenges the United States is facing, especially things which Trump has thrown in the world arena, do you expect whatever is the tension will between the two countries, which becomes somewhat of a Cold War?
Well, very much so. And this isn't my prediction. It is really the prediction, the expectation, the plan under the Obama administration. It was considered an Obama-Clinton policy at the time, what was called the Access to Asia, which was to refocus U.S. military, to create missile batteries around China, to create much larger troop deployments, to move aircraft battle carrier groups. That's not one aircraft carrier. That can be thousands of soldiers and many, many hundreds of troops in the South China Sea. All of this has gone on under both the Obama and the Trump administration. Trump administration even more aggressively with not only sanctions, but racist demonization, anti-racist, that reflects back here within the U.S. So the climate, the political climate, the blame game, the imposition of a whole new round of sanctions, a trade war, and the cancellation of tens of thousands of students, Chinese students who study here, who suddenly are just told, no, right in the middle of the semester, they're already here, go home. There's a cancellation of cultural and art projects and all kinds of things that were happening collaboratively that suddenly have been canceled by the US, and demands for against Huawei, and we could go on, the series of economic and military, political and diplomatic cuts in a relationship with China that had been going on for 40 years. And there is suddenly an abrupt right turn and a whole new threatening climate. So yes, this is really a Cold War with China, and a war that could only exacerbate, and it's disastrous for both China and for the US.
Don't you think that President Trump worked against the trade pact in the South China area, in which he withdrew what Clinton and Obama were building? But you're saying he did not do that, and he's continuing the similar policies.
Well, Trump made it much worse, and took, you could say, what was the Obama-Biden policy, and they were the ones who initiated the pivot to Asia. And it was justified at the time. Hillary Clinton wrote on this, spoke on it. Others did also, that China was a new rising power, that this was a threat to US policy, to US interests. Now, China is a formerly colonized, oppressed country, underdeveloped country that has made a rapid transition. This was first welcomed by the US and now is considered very threatening because of how quick the technological and industrial advance is, a huge change in the living standards of people of China, 800 million pulled out of poverty. So this is threatening to US corporate power. We can't forget that for really 150 years, there were US military gunboats, Marines in China from the 1820s and the Opium War on. There was a US Navy that patrolled the rivers of China, literally 1,000 miles inland, imposing trade agreements with guns, with the barrel of a gun. It impoverished China, and China hasn't forgotten it. But also, US corporate power knows this is the biggest, largest concentration of wealth, of people, and of technology, and that is threatening to them rather than being embraced.
So that history is not much known. Do Americans on the street forget about them? But in academics know this, that American warship has been 1,000 miles inside China.
No, I think the average person doesn't know any of the history of China. They had one picture of China as poor, as underdeveloped, as starving. I can think when I was a child, that was the image of China. And then China that was very threatening after the revolution, and during the Korean War, Vietnam War, always China was the enemy. And then for years, China as a very profitable, low-wage investment. So there have been different images of China, but none of them have really discussed the difference between the interests of the people in the US, the average person who's very interested in things in China, and corporate power on can they control this process and who has the upper hand. And now they realize they're not going to have the upper hand in China. So in many ways, there's not one day that goes by where you won't see in the major media a very hostile article against China every day, and every day on the news. I mean, almost without exception, you will see this again and again, and it creates a different awareness. But they do not mention their own policy, as I say, from the 1820s to 1949 and the Chinese Revolution. There were US troops in China, except during World War II when there were totally Japanese troops. US forces came back. It has not been a friendly history. And the aircraft carriers in the South China Sea are extremely threatening to China. You could picture if there were Chinese aircraft carriers right off the coast of Houston, Texas, and New Orleans and Louisiana. in the Gulf of Mexico. This would be as threatening as to what U.S. aircraft carriers are today in the South China Sea, or the missile batteries in Korea and in Japan, Philippines, where they're aggressively pointing at China. This is very threatening to the people of China. And,
you're watching Muslim Network TV, and this is Imam Malik Mujahid talking with longtime peace activist Sara Flounders, and we'll be right back after these messages.
My wife, she's a professor at the University of Cincinnati, who's Catholic, and by her watching and listening to our 3-year-old son watch Adam's World, she ended up taking Kalima Shahada. She embraced Islam because she learned so much about Islam and the other prophets. It really affected our life in a great way, and because of Sound Vision and Adam's World, we're Muslims.
I took my Shahada 15 years ago, and I actually am from a rural part of Ohio. And so I found the catalog for Sound Vision, and I ordered the tapes and the CDs and the books, and I used those, and especially for my little daughter, that's how we basically learned our Islam, and Islam entered our hearts through the wonderful works of Sound Vision.
Okay, assalamu alaikum, brother. I just want you to know that I love the Sound Vision website, that a lot of times when I'm looking for information, especially as it relates to homelessness, domestic violence, and women issues, I go to that website, and then I see what you've written, and then I copy and paste it and spread the word, because the wisdom is there, so I can't do any better than what Sound Vision has already done.
Sound Vision is our survival guide. It is the organization that provides skills for Muslims how to survive and thrive in this community here in the U.S.
Assalamu alaikum, my name is Anam, I'm in 11th grade, and I grew up with Adam's World, and what it taught me was unity, respect, and love for the Muslim Ummah.
Adam's World is the greatest show ever made. Take me to the Kaaba, man. I love that puppet.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Sara Flounders. China, a communist country, a totalitarian country, it has lifted most of its population out of poverty in a matter of 40 years or so. China, neighboring country India considered itself to be a socialist and democratic country. And as you know, poverty is rampant. I mean, farmers right now are blocking their capital, Delhi, because of the policies they're adopting. So do you think that probably scholars have, I remember scholars in 70s and 80s especially were discussing which model worked better, a democratic socialist model or the communist model in which they have open, sort of capitalist openings to it. And it seems like in terms of net result from the perspective of individual poor persons, China with its system seems to have performed way better than India. Are there anybody who's comparing these things with Indian constitution is a socialist country as well?
Well, the Indian constitution and the aspirations in India were for socialism. And so that was included in word. And a few industries were nationalized under pressure. And this was true from railroads to steel to some garment and so on in India. But overwhelmingly, the state was run and controlled by the capitalist class. And every way in which to keep the masses of people without their own representation was utilized. And we see where it has led, where there's really a racist anti-Muslim government today, the Modi government, with the backing of the capitalists as the crisis deepens in India, and they want to divert attention and divert it in ugly directions, such as Trump's policy here against migrants. Now, in China, they used a different way. There are capitalists in China, but the state says we will control. They don't get to run the entire show and expropriate all the wealth and put it only into their interests. We're going to use the wealth and the industries in China to raise the educational level, the housing level. They began with the most basic mass immunization programs and mass literacy, and it has moved steadily forward into literally millions of new housing units. When you see China today with the bullet trains that are everywhere, with 20 new subway lines in Shanghai and in Beijing, and actually every city in China now with modern new metro stations. I was staggered. Actually, I visited China in October just for a few weeks, and to see subway stations, every single one with elevators, escalators.
You mean October, just a couple of months ago?
Yes, back in October. Yeah.
Huh.
So no, October of 2019.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I thought you went.
No, not during this period. Not allowed. But anyway, during that time, what I was staggered because I didn't really realize just the level of modernization in China, and in a way that is enormously enthusiastic. Now, I've traveled to India and also to Bangladesh and to Pakistan. You don't see this in other parts of Asia, although there are strong movements that have fought for workers' rights and for peasant rights, but they don't run the state. And the level of poverty is just staggering. And still the level of illiteracy and people not knowing where their next meal will come from. So I do think there's a difference, a big difference in the results for people today. Both came from, in these countries, there were enormous social upheavals, not only in China, but in India, in Bangladesh, and in Pakistan in different ways, but big explosive movements of the people. And yet the results today show that when there is a real socialist reorganization of society in the interests of working people, and when there's real control of the capitalist class, China brought in capitalists. They allowed some Chinese people who, because they could deal with the West, they've ended up as billionaires in this generation, We'll see where that goes. But for right now, how else is China going to deal with the West? For 30 years, they had been completely sanctioned. From 1949 to 1979, China couldn't import a hairpin from the US. So technology and industry and science was walled off from them. They made a real struggle to lift that and made many concessions and allowed all kinds of US factories, European and Japanese factories, into China. China made only one condition: we get to keep the technology. You can't just move the plant out now to another country. And that has also made a difference because they put some controls. That doesn't exist in India today. Anyone, any capitalist in the world can go to India, set up an industry, use cheap labor, and move it the next day
Not
to
only
a
that,
poorer country.
not only that, but in any factory, workers don't get to elect the bargaining agent. They can have as many unions as they want. I was shocked to see that a country which is socialist by constitution, workers cannot elect a bargaining agent. Let's move on to your book, Capitalism on Ventilator. Very interesting choice of words there. But wow, was it the title which got you banned from Amazon?
I think it's the very concept. The full title is Capitalism on a Ventilator: The Impact of COVID-19 in China and in the US. And even though there have been tens of thousands of articles written on COVID-19 in the US today, throughout Europe, throughout the world, any comparison, we now hear they expect in the Biden administration that by February, the toll, the death toll from body bags, will be 500,000, 500,000. And yet in China, 5,000, still under 5,000. I think it's 4,600 and something deaths. Why this incredible difference? And here in the US, there is not a national health plan. There's no coordination whatsoever. Even in the testing, it took months and months, and yet still 10 months in, you see long lines of people waiting for tests. They're not coordinated. There's no tracking. When we say capitalism on a ventilator, healthcare in the US is more expensive than anywhere in the world. It's more profitable, and yet less people have the health care they need than any industrialized country. So the capitalists run the healthcare system in the US, and it's more and more monopolized in their interests. So you could have huge testing and even vaccination efforts where billions of dollars are put into developing vaccines, but then they're owned by Pfizer or Moderna, and they are using the most expensive technology that's hard to patent anywhere else in the world. What will people in Africa do? People in Asia, throughout the world, if they have to use ultra cold, more than 70 degrees minus Celsius to use a vaccine. So we have a very expensive technology here in the US, but it acts totally in the interests of private capitalist corporations. And the average person does still not, even under the Obamacare plan, still does not have real health care, dental care, eye care, even for children. It is such a patchwork. People dread going to the doctor because it's so complicated. So this is only one part of the problem in the US. We face
But Sarah, my question is, why Amazon banned your books?
Okay, all right, thank you.
Things are sold there.
Right. Okay.
They didn't like the cover, they didn't like the title, or why Amazon would sell almost everything?
Amazon sells just almost anything. That's absolutely true.
So do they read books?
When we first posted the book, it was accepted, as they say, in 5 minutes, in an hour. Next day, there it was. And then when we posted the sort of the final version, we suddenly had a notice from them saying that this was not an authorized view of COVID-19, and the book should be amended to an authorized view. Now, we look to see what is an authorized view even? What did they mean? What accommodation, what change did they want? And it was clear that it was the comparison and also an indictment of what is wrong in the US and disastrously wrong and getting much worse. They didn't want that study. They will allow voices that say the pandemic doesn't exist, that the numbers are inflated, that masks and social distancing and a basic scientific approach make no difference. All that is allowed. All kinds of crackpot theories are allowed. But to say, let's examine what is wrong in this country, that the rates are higher than anywhere in the world, and the spikes are worse, even after months and months of warning. I mean, we're 10 months into this. What is there in the US that we gotta be examining? And if we're gonna look at our society and make demands for change, we have to have a picture of what's missing. And what do other countries who have controlled this virus can be contained. That doesn't mean it's not real and serious and deadly. But with
Well, it seems, Sarah, the pandemic seems to be very productive time for you. You wrote the whole book about the pandemic.
No, I didn't write it all. This is an anthology. It has about 55 chapters. What I decided to do was to look at who was commenting from many different, the Black Alliance for Peace, from Fair and Accuracy in Reporting, from Popular Resistance, from all different sites, who was looking at this and saying, what does it show us about our society? What should we be doing differently? And let's put this together. So it was quite a number of permissions to get. Of course, I have my own chapters in there, and I put forth my view. But I thought, well, it shouldn't only be my view. Let's gather a whole number of other published authors. That's what made also the Amazon refusal so shocking. They're carrying books by these people on their site, but they don't want this particular discussion of what's wrong in the US and how our other countries. We could look at Vietnam. That's not on the US target list right now, and yet they had really a workers' party that did a social mobilization of the whole people, and their numbers are under 100 deaths. They're just Vietnam, just south of China. They were in contact, but they immediately mobilized the population. They have very low technology. They couldn't even do testing, but they had an effective social mobilization of the whole people to take this seriously and to, in the meantime, close schools, close businesses and restaurants strictly for a month and guarantee that everyone would eat, that there would be food deliveries everywhere. So this can be done even by poor countries when they mobilize the population, but it seems impossible here.
You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Sara Flounders. We will be right back after these messages.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, it's your brother Zain Bika from South Africa. One of the first educational programs ever produced for Muslim children was the ever popular Adam's World series. The colorful and comical Muslim puppets stole the heart of a generation. Sound Vision will be releasing brand new episodes of Adam's World with the launch of a Adam's World app. Subscribers will enjoy new Adam's World episodes as they are released, as well as all the classic episodes of Adam's World. So visit adamsworldapp.com now to learn more, subscribe and enjoy new adventures of Adam and his friends. And let's keep helping tomorrow's Muslims today. Assalamu alaikum.
Adam's world. Believe me, there's a lot to see. Bismillah, let's explore.
Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Sara Flounders, who is a longtime peace activist. How did you get involved in the peace movement? I mean, is it the influence of your parents or your buddies, or it's the neighborhood you were in, or the books you were reading? How you chose this path?
Just before I jump to that, let me say that for Capitalism on a Ventilator, the impact of COVID-19 in China and the US, do just check it out because it was just released this week and we're very glad it's finally in print, even without Amazon. But how did I get involved more than 50 years ago? I was very much, you could say, a child of the 60s, a period of enormous hope, enthusiasm for change, big social movements. The civil rights movement impacted me deeply, the anti-war movement, and the expectation that people in motion making demands can make changes. So this for me had a very powerful impact. I actually grew up in a rather, conservative, religiously conservative home, and very loving, large family. There were 6 kids. But at the same time, I also, my mother in World War II had been active in the underground, and if anything, it made her fearful of political activity afterwards, knowing that the consequences can be deadly. But she understood when I became very much an activist in another way. So you could say, did it go from generation to generation? I don't know. I do know that what has held my interest in all of this is when people come together and actually build solidarity, they are able to change, if not the world on that day, at least their immediate circumstances, whether they're winning a union or a tenant organization or a move back in rent. The smallest changes are only possible when there are demands put forward in an organized way and people are committed to making that change. And that has always held my interest very deeply. I do think that the problems in this society are so deep. It is a country built on racism, on slavery, really on the genocide of indigenous people. And that runs deep. It's a poison that exists in this society. and needs to be constantly challenged and combated. I think this summer we saw a huge upsurge of the Black Lives Movement, millions of people in the streets. And because people moved into the streets at that time, when they did polls, 80% of the people said they understood. Now, if they did that same poll today, when things quiet down and there aren't demands being made, consciousness also goes down. So I think keeping things in motion is a very important way to make changes in people's thinking and to make changes in what they feel they have a right to expect.
You mentioned your mother was underground. What underground was it?
Oh, she was Belgian, and this was the anti-fascist, anti-German.
In US or in Germany?
No, she was Belgian, and she was a young teenager in Belgium during the Nazi occupation.
Resistance there.
And there was quite a strong resistance movement, and she identified with it passionately and was active in it. Yeah.
Hmm. So you were born in the U.S.
Yeah. No, I was born here, but maybe it's in part when I think of my identification with the civil rights movement and with the anti-war movement. I kind of link it maybe to that, but I think young people identify more with their generation, with their peers than their parents. So I think it was the impact of people around me too who were fighting for change.
Let's talk a little bit about the US and socialism. What's the history of socialist movement in this country?
Well, it's both one of the oldest movements in the US, really from the 1840s and 50s. And of course, there have been strong socialist movements, strong anarchist movements, strong communist movements in the US that have really pushed forward for change. You could look at what they call the Wobblies, who opposed World War I and organized some of the earliest unions, the International Workers of the World, through to the communist movement, to all sorts of socialist movements. There has been a long, long history. Thinking of my husband and his father, who was very involved in the garment workers union, and all of the changes that this made possible in the lives of working people, whether you were going to work, in Jersey City, where I am, is right next to Patterson. I was looking at the demands there of a strike in the 1920s for the 60-hour work week. Can you imagine? That was because workers were working 72 hours a week. It doesn't even seem humanly possible. So there have been real changes, in the union movement, in socialist movements. I identified very deeply with the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement. Every one of these movements for change, and for a change in the way people see themselves and identify, are very important. And then in turn, people make demands, and they organize together. Without it, and as you are so acutely aware, and we could look at the period around 9/11 when there was an attack nationally on Muslims, and it was the socialist movement and the anti-war movement who immediately got what was happening based on their own past experiences and connected the attacks on Muslims to the character of racist attacks that had gone on against countless generations of immigrant peoples. So I think struggles linked together and also learned from each other, that's very important. I think it's important, while I can raise my views very, very sharply, at the same time, I want to respect other people in the movement who are also fighting for change, given the framework they're coming from. That's important.
Muslim community you mentioned after 9/11 and their support coming from left-leaning organizations, anti-war movement, and they were standing as allies and and working together. I mean, marching together.
Yeah.
But some changes came into that. And one of the conflict was that Muslim countries, many of the Muslims have a view of communism as a totalitarian which does not respect the rights of individual opinion and difference of opinion. And in support of, for example, the in Syrian democracy movement, while the anti-war movement, a good part of it was in support of the Assad regime. And the communities around in North America who were not aware, not necessarily against Assad regime and whatnot, but they were supportive of the movement for people's right to election and free choice and things stuff like that. So peaceful movement and Assad. So I know it's a complex history. There are very well-defined two different opinion on that. And that's sort of, so question I would ask you, why it is so important for peace movement to be more ideologically grounded. And that's what the Muslim community by and large felt when it started sort of withering away somewhat from the peace movement, is still feeling of love and solidarity, is still feeling that we stand together when it comes to military-industrial complex. The world need to be just. There need to be demilitarization. All stand in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. But when it comes to Syria, gradually all those people who are marching with the peace movement, they started seeing me, for example, that you are more accommodative to dictators as compared to people's aspiration for their lives. So would you like, I mean, I don't know whether I'm giving you a clear question, but this has been an issue.
It is an issue, and I will say what has been consistent within the peace movement is to say that the United States military and U.S. corporations have no right to decide the future of Syria or Iraq or Libya or Egypt or any country in the world. And when they say they're fighting for democracy in Libya and they end up bombing the entire country, destroying everything and assassinating the leader, and then leaving a ruin behind, that was not about democracy. Although there was all kinds of support here in the US for this democratic change that was going to come. And the same thing happened in Syria. There was an effort, all-out effort by the US, British, and French against Syria, regime change, how to reoccupy a formerly colonized area and impose their rule again. And Syria at the time had the highest level of education and healthcare. Now, the war to bring Assad down, the US invested hundreds of thousands. There were more than 100,000 mercenary forces in Syria. A quarter of the population ended up refugees and displaced. The country was left in ruins with an effort to impose a government that had the approval of the United States, the French, and the British, not the Syrian people. During this time, Syria organized elections right really from the battlefield and from the cities. And there was a resistance primarily because they said the US, British, the French, they don't get to decide. There were people who, it's not that they were for Assad, but they were against a Western imposed intervention. And they saw the forces at war to bring down Assad, not as a coherent democratic opposition, but as a great many mercenaries who were being paid also by Saudi Arabia. Israel was on the side of these same forces, along with the US openly bombing from the skies. So that created a nationalist resistance within Syria. I traveled to Syria a couple times during that war, times when it was extremely dangerous on the ground. And there were enormous level still of support for the government, including from people who, as I say, had had criticisms in the past. The Syrian Communist Party, who had not been pro-Assad, but they were against the West having a say in how Syria would run. And in those conditions, all kinds of groups supported the Syrian government and Assad and fought there must have been 100 different groups that couldn't coordinate with each other, that fought each other and fought the government. And it broke up Syria in a very damaging way. You wouldn't say today that Syria has the highest educational and health level. This was a very modern country if you think back to 2010, just 10 years ago. Even though US sanctions in Syria began at the time of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. From the beginning, they wanted to also bring down Syria and Libya and Iran. They call them the axis of evil. So US occupation in a region, such as in Iraq and in Afghanistan, that's not the end of it. They want to take it the next step. They want to take it into Syria. They want to take it into Libya. And they did in Libya. And there's nothing better that's no democratic government in Libya today. There's really howling misery. There are literally slave camps, slave markets in Libya today. You see some of the coverage. It is horrendous. And you also do see in Syria today a great deal of poverty, of migrants who've been forced to leave, whether to Europe or to Lebanon or to Jordan. They find refuge wherever they can because they're escaping a war in their own country. Now, many of them, it was very interesting, when there were elections held in Syria and the refugees were able to participate, which they did, Lebanon and several countries, they actually voted overwhelmingly for Assad, even though they had left for the safety of their own families. That was interesting. That was very interesting. What did it mean? It meant they didn't want a Western imposition on their country, even, as I say, even if they were living in another country for the safety of their family. So I think the view of the anti-war movement in the US, if we can stay consistent to say US wars do not bring peace, they don't bring democracy, and they're not intended to.
Yes, in this point, they're consistent, but on the point of the people, the Syrians I meet, I'm a religious person, I'm a conservative Muslim, I go to mosques, and all the Syrians I meet, they, not now, for long, way before this war began and Arab Spring, they have been complaining about how horrible and torturous the Assad regime is. And they continuously stand on that. And there are torture victims around, there are people who have stories. So I do see that, on one side, so why peace movement cannot say both things? Assad regime need to reform, democratize. Assad regime has problems. But at the same time, people there have a right to decide about that. And America and foreign powers who have track record of destroying Iraq and Libya and other countries, and who very conveniently ignore democracy in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, have no rights to involve. So why peace movement cannot be principled in support of people as well as in against war?
Well, I think my view, they're very consistent in saying that U.S. wars are not for democracy. They're not in defense of Muslim people either. Egypt is a very good example of where there was an elected government. Overwhelmingly, Morsi came from Islamic forces, and yet the defense, the support of the Sisi overthrow of the Morsi government in Egypt came overwhelmingly from the US. So the US government is not interested in defending Muslims anywhere in the world. They are interested in creating division, in supporting dictatorships. Yes, that they have done very effectively. And that was their interest in Syria.
So
now, in
that's
Syria,
probably
just to finish, in Syria and here, I've met both Sunni and Shia and Alawite Muslims, and many Christian and Catholic and Orthodox and all different. Syria was a mosaic of many, many different religious groupings of Kurdish and Syrian and all different nationalities. And yet US support has meant to play off one group against another and arm the militias of every different grouping so that they're fighting each other. That is not building solidarity, nor is it in the interests of building solidarity. It's not in the interests of building solidarity or listening to the will of the people in Egypt either. How could the US claim that they're supporting Muslims in Syria and then do what they did in Egypt against an elected popular government, the Morsi government?
Well, thank you so much, Sara Flounders, for being with us.
Okay.
Really appreciate that. There is a whole lot of other questions I have written, but not much time left. So truly appreciate you being with us. And thank you, Sherdil Khan and Dr. Abdul Wahid for producing today's show. Stay tuned. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, as well as on OTT devices like Apple TV, Amazon, Fire TV, Roku. And you can download our app, Muslim Network TV, on your cell phones from Android or iPhone. And our website, you can visit muslimnetwork.tv. And stay tuned for further programming. Peace and salam.
And thank you for very challenging questions.
Thank you.